Gene, in this episode, we talked to writer Kevin Powell about all these complications and contradictions that surround Tupac and his legacy. Kevin was a young journalist at Vibe magazine who wrote a couple cover stories on Pac. He did a jailhouse interview with him from Rikers Island. And Pac looms really large in Kevin's life.
People who don't understand hip-hop or understand pop culture will never understand why these pop culture figures are our senators. They are our congresspeople. They are our presidents. They have an impact on us in ways that people will never understand unless they, in their own time, felt that way about the Beatles or Bob Dylan or Joni Mitchell or Nina Simone. It's the same exact thing.
And Kevin Powell spent 3 crazy years covering Pac's life for Vibe. And, all these years later, he's still trying to process his death. But I think we need to go back to 1996 real quick. Mm-hmm. So it was September 7th, and Tupac was shot in Las Vegas. And Kevin actually headed out there to cover it for Rolling Stone.
And, Gene, we know it wasn't the first time Pac had been shot. Nope. Part of the Tupac folklore was that he lived after being shot 5 times.
It was like he was a Superman, like a mythical figure. You know what I mean? Not that he was better than anybody, but, people are like, well, he'll be okay. The next day, September 13th, it was a Friday. I'll never forget it. They're in Vegas. I'm sitting there watching on HBO Denzel Washington playing Malcolm X. It's the scene where Malcolm X is on his way to the Audubon Ballroom and is about to be assassinated, and you hear the song from Sam Cooke, A Change Is Gonna Come, playing. Just as that was going on, I get a call from Allison Samuels, who's been a longtime journalist for Newsweek magazine. She said 2 words, Pac's dead. And I just started crying. I went to the hospital like everybody else did, and, you are in shock. I'm not a drinker anymore, but that night I went to the exact corner where Pac got shot. I drank liquor and I poured out, as we do in the hoods of America, the rest on the ground. I didn't know what else to do. You know what I mean? It was one of the most traumatic experiences of my life.
That's Kevin Powell, and he's going to talk with us about what Tupac means in 2016 after a short break.
And it may sound crazy since we're talking about Tupac, but yeah, we got to warn you. There's some explicit language in the music we'll hear.
Stay with us. This is Code Switch.
Listening to Code Switch, we're back. I'm Shireen Marisol Meraji.
And I'm Gene Demby.
All right, Gene, let's get into this interview about Tupac's legacy with Kevin Powell. Mm-hmm. He starts things off by ranking Pac's rap prowess. Uh-oh.
Here we go.
Hindsight's 20/20 for me now because I've had 20 years to really process this thing. And I think he was an incredibly talented artist in many different ways, but I would never put him in my top 5 greatest rappers of all time.
For a lot of people. I would agree with you, but that would be sacrilege for a lot of people.
It's interesting that you're both from the East Coast. I just want to point that out.
Well, so is Tupac Shakur, though.
Well, okay, fine. But he did have love for California, especially the Bay Area.
Absolutely. And But I would put rappers like Snoop Dogg and Ice Cube and Kendrick Lamar, who is greatly influenced by Tupac, ahead of Tupac in terms of overall skills. We're talking about content, lyrical flow. Pac had great moments. Like I remember when I did the Rikers Island interview when he was in prison, and we were given a copy of Dear Mama, and the song blew me away because I'd never heard anything like that. And I still think that's one of the most important songs ever made about a son's love for his mother in any genre of music.
And even as a crack fiend, mama, you always was the black queen, mama. I finally understand for a woman it ain't easy trying to raise a man.
But I just think that we never got to see his full potential either as an actor or as a rapper because his life was cut short at 25.
Right. I mean, but you don't think his lyricism would have evolved?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
To maybe surpass the Kendrick Lamars or the...
I see what your thumb on the scale.
You're a Tupac fan.
Yeah.
I love
I'm not.
Tupac.
No, me? No.
I'm a Tupac fan. I'm a massive Tupac fan. But no,
I am too.
He was 25.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Think about, John Lennon got to live to 40. Bob Marley got to live to 36. Imagine what Pac, if he would have been 30, if he would have been 35. Imagine Pac now with all the stuff happening in this country, the things he would have been writing about, because he was that artist. He had the ability to write the kind of political poetry of a Bob Dylan, of a Marley. He was a street poet. He understood the masses of people because he was always in touch with people. And I think, it's rare that you encounter someone like that. Folks get so caught up in who's the greatest rappers of all time. The reason why Pac, to me, is one of the most important figures in pop culture, period, is because he transcended his art form and became a person of the people. I've met a young man whose father is the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, one of the major ones in this country. It was at an elite boarding school in Northern California, Shireen, and This young man sat in the front row. He had a Tupac Shakur shirt on. When the program was over, all of 17 years old, had not been born again before Pac died. And he said, Tupac is my hero. You know, I'm in Barbados in the West Indies, and I'm hanging out in the cut with Rastafarians eating Ital food. The word gets around that an American writer's there. A young Asian brother comes up and had us on a Tupac shirt. He said, when I was in prison, I read Tupac's articles that you wrote, and that saved my life. I mean, this is the kind of impact that we're talking about. I'm in Ireland with my friend, Irish brother, and he says to me, Kev, now that you're here, and this young man was all of 28, 29, Pac is the biggest rapper in Ireland. I said, Pac is dead. He said, it doesn't matter.
Wow.
You know what I mean?
Because in Cuba, too. When I was in Cuba in 1999, I mean, they absolutely adore Tupac.
In Cuba, people of all different backgrounds, I love Tupac. It's blown my mind.
Why,
in these 20 years.
Like,
Why?
I mean, what is it about Pac that resonates so much with people? I mean, he's like he fits into this mold. It's a familiar mold of like black masculinity. It's like
right.
Like Malcolm sort of inhabited this template. The Black
Right.
Panthers, you know, Huey Newton and those folks sort of did as well. Like both dangerous but sort of autodidacts who were like worldly and asked big questions.
Because of his background, because Pac was born to a woman, Afeni Shakur, may she rest in peace, who was an intellectual, who was a scholar, but who also was a Black Panther Party member, as we know, who was someone who was of the movement, of the people, because his stepfather was Mutulu Shakur, a longtime political prisoner, because he was a movement baby, a product of the civil rights movement.
But he was ambivalent, right? To the figures in that movement.
Well, I want to stress this. Pac was in his 20s, so sometimes he was, sometimes he wasn't. There's a lot of us who, I'm a movement baby, if you will, and that's one of the things that drew me to Tupac, because I was an activist since the time I was a teenager. And so, you know, you want to see a world where there actually is change, where there is no oppression, but then you wonder why it's not happening. And that's where the ambivalence comes from. And there was also that tension, you know, with our generation, Generation X, and even with the millennials now, who've kickstarted Black Lives Matter, other movements, with that generation, the boomers, the civil rights generation, like, well, you say all this stuff, but what has actually happened? What has actually changed? But at the same time, I feel that Pac never stopped speaking to the conditions of people on this planet. I mean, you listen to the Machiavelli album, you know, the thing that was put out right after he died. I mean, these are incredible tracks. I actually think that's probably one of his finest albums, because of the no-nonsense approach to talking about struggle and oppression on this planet.
Penitentiaries is packed with promise makers. Never realized the precious time that bitch niggas is wasting. Institutionalized, I live my life a product made to crumble.
Is the Pac of... I know, like, we're all complicated. We all have, you know, multiple facets to who we are. But it's the Pac of, like, you know, how do you want it? And some of the stuff that's, like, much more politically tinged.
Changes or something.
Yeah, change, like, exactly.
I see no changes. Can a brother get a little peace? It's war on the streets and a war in the Middle East. Instead of war on poverty, they got a war on drugs so the police can bother me.
Are those reconcilable? Like, I mean, does that diminish the more pointed political stuff?
Well, you know, what I think diminishes is, you know, the sexual assault case that he caught here in New York City.
Right.
You know, I think the Hit 'Em Up song against Biggie and Diddy, that undermines, in some ways, Keep Your Head Up, you know, which is an important song. I mean, this man in Keep Your Head Up is talking about being pro-choice.
Since a man can't make one, he has no right to tell a woman when and where to create one.
You know, and supporting women's right to choose. He's talking about
I know you fed up, ladies.
feminism.
Keep your head up.
But then Pac gets this charge and he says these other things. And so, again, I want to stress, you know, when I met Tupac, he was 21, 22 years. It was on the heels of his first album being successful. And, you know, the recognition he got as the clear star of the film Juice, which took him to a whole nother level. And now you're famous. And you haven't really dealt with the traumas of your childhood, being born in New York, moving to Baltimore, moving to Northern California, you know, all over the place. I mean, not knowing who your father was, not even knowing your biological father was alive until the last couple of years of your life. Growing up in horrific poverty, your mother becoming addicted to crack cocaine at some point in your teenage years, you know, and now you're famous and you're having to process all of this stuff. And so I always say to people, it's also important to take a step back. You know, like a John Lennon, even though, you know, it's sad to me that, and Lennon's my favorite Beatle, died at 40. He was killed at 40, you know, but he got to go back and reflect on, you know what, John Lennon in his 20s was a batterer to Cynthia Lennon. You know, I should not treat women that way. Sexism, violence against women and girls is not acceptable.
That's right.
And that's Pac never got to turn that corner is what I always say to people. Let's look at the positive things that Pac was about. He was always about the community. He was very loyal to people, And the stuff that was contradictory or seemed to undermine, we need to take those as life lessons. And I think Pac never got to reconcile those things. And that's why we see these multiple Pacs that people are drawn to. I'm on Twitter. Some people are quoting Pac as if he's a scholar teaching at Harvard University. Then there are other people quoting Pac like, yo, son, let's go F them up real quick. You know what I mean? Life goes on, son. You know what I mean?
I mean, Kevin, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and also on the heels of the Nate Parker controversy, is this sexual assault conviction, all of this, if it would have happened in 2016 in the age of Twitter, do you think we would be so reverent of Tupac Shakur? Would he have this legacy that we're talking about 20 years later? If all that went down in 2016 and we were having this conversation that we're having right now in like 2036?
Well, it's an interesting question because, I've thought about it a lot because I'm around the folks who are connected to this whole thing with Nate Parker and the birth of a nation. And one of the things I said is that I don't know how Pac would have been treated if he was in the era of Twitter and Facebook, social media. But one thing we got to remember, if people go back and look at the interview that I did with Pac at Rikers Island, I didn't pull any punches. I said, Pac, what happened in that hotel room? He maintained his innocence, but what he said is, what I am guilty of is that I didn't stop those other men from assaulting her, from taking advantage of that woman, and I'm responsible for that. And that's something that I think people need to think about, because how many men do you know, who would actually say something like that at 23, 24, or 44, or 64, to actually take ownership for their sexism, their patriarchy, their misogyny? So even at that early stage, Pac understood it, that he had to take ownership. And he said, I'm trying to figure this thing out. So I think what people would see if it was the era of social media, Pac was always honest. He was honest about everything. He expressed his vulnerability. He expressed how he felt, if he was hurt, if he was happy. I think that Pac could have become an example of the kind of masculinity, the kind of manhood we need to move toward in this country, with the right guidance. That's the thing that was missing, because like me and so many other young men who come from urban environments, we had no fathers. We had no mentors. I know that now as an older man, how many younger men I mentor, who are clueless about being a man. Pac was no different. He just happened to be world famous.
In your Rikers interview with him, he's like, there's this evil inside of me and I want to get it out. I want to do better. I want to do good. Do you think that turned after he got out?
Let me tell you, the Rikers Island interview, the prison interview, was in January 1995. Pac spills his soul to me, which meant he spilled it to everybody who read the article all over the country and all over the world. I'm going to change. I'm going to stop smoking weed. I'm going to stop smoking cigarettes. I'm your child, and basically I want to be held accountable. Fast forward to the Death Row cover at the end of the year, 1995, which is the last time I spoke to Tupac. I show up on the set of the California Love video. Pac is out there counting mad money, that Sugar's giving him. Before he even did that, I knocked on his trailer door. The door opens and a gust of marijuana smoke comes out. I was like, oh, wow, this is the Pac who said he wasn't going to smoke weed anymore. So it's hard to say. I think that Pac evolved in terms of his understanding of what his significance was, what his role was. If you look at Pac in the last year or so of his life, he was actually mentoring younger artists. He was only 24, 25. So I think he understood he had a responsibility to share what he had learned with other people. He was evolving in terms of his understanding of business, what he needed to control for himself. I just don't know where he was evolving, honestly, in terms of his personal development,
Yeah.
I mean, the man was a sex symbol, for women, but he also becomes someone you can talk about sexism and misogyny because of some of the things that he did, as we discussed earlier. He represents various forms of masculinity. He represents hip hop. He represents pop culture. He represents making something out of nothing, which is the essence of the definition of hip hop. You know what I mean? He represents that middle finger, which is resistance. That's Occupy Wall Street. That's the Black Lives Matter movement. That's any people who feel like they've been disrespected and disregarded by the power structure on this planet. Pac covered all of those bases.
Are we being critical enough?
About Tupac
20 years
Shakur?
out? Yeah.
I'm critical all the time because I said, no, I can't support the sexism, can't support the overuse of the N-word. And I come from the hood. I come from the environment that created hip hop. I'm of the culture. I'm a hip hop head for life. So I think we should be critical, always be critical. I don't believe in putting people on a pedestal. Like people will always say, well, Kev, what did you learn from Tupac? And I'll say, well, first of all, I was 5 years older than him, so I think he learned some things from me as well. You know what I'm saying? I think it goes both ways. But we also know that we live in a society, in a world that is celebrity obsessed, that tends to put people on pedestals and make them into mythological figures. What I'm most interested in is the humanity of Tupac, the good parts, the bad parts, and the parts in between, so I can get a fuller picture of who he was as a whole human being.